Welcome to the RH Vodcast. Today, our guest is a seasoned creative technologist, a trilingual speaker of English, Cantonese, and Mandarin. He has rich experience in the field of sales, entertainment, and events. He has worked his way up through Shadow Factory to become their Chief Metaverse Officer. As an aside, Shadow Factory is a full-service digital creative agency and gaming studio based in the USA, Canada, and Hong Kong. He is the guy who you want to go to if you want to know about the metaverse. We are very honored today to welcome the very charismatic Lewis Lupton. How are you doing, Lewis?
Very good, Chris. Thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure. Let's get started. I want to talk about your early life, if we may. Do you think you could just start us off by speaking to your earliest years growing up in Hong Kong? Maybe what was your parents' background and what influence did they have on you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So born and raised in Hong Kong, 93. Grew up in the sort of local ends of Tin Shui Wai. Dad was Scottish, mum was from Hong Kong. I think as far as I remember, I don't remember exactly what my dad did, but definitely something along the lines of tech when I was a kid. I just remember, like, you know, computers and everything. Like, he was just sort of, he had all the gadgets, all the toys. Mum was quite sort of stay-at-home housewife. So I think there was a bit of a tech influence as I was growing up. And yeah, like it was definitely, you know, like most kind of kids as well, you know, gaming, anime, a lot of the fun sort of like Asian IPs that we kind of grew in love here in Asia, especially from Japan. Big influence on me. But then ironically also being, you know, sort of half Caucasian as well. A lot of like the US cartoons, Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, that all had a big influence on me as a young kid as well. So yeah, I think very playful child trying to find his way in busy, bustling Hong Kong.
You've described Web3 as a gamification of the internet. Do you have any anecdotes about maybe your earliest influences, which kind of showed that you would go on to have a career in the industry of gamification?
Oh man, I wouldn't. In terms of creating, I mean, like the opportunities and the amount of like coincidences I think throughout my life when sort of gaming, not just online gaming, but just game as a whole, kind of like had an intertwine with my life. It was many different places. I think one of the biggest moments for me was there was a game when I was in primary school called RuneScape.
Yeah. Right.
And some you know, OG gamers might remember this platform, but it was a very early stage, what we call an MMORPG, right? Massive multiplayer online role-playing game. And essentially this was a game that even in Hong Kong took all the schools by storm. Definitely, like, that was the first time in my life I remember when I made real money just by gaming for a little bit. Harvesting, like, materials after school for a couple of hours and then meeting my mate at recess, giving, like, I think I got 40 Hong Kong dollars for about, like, I think 4,000 bricks of wood.
Wow.
And at that point on, there was just this little moment that was like, oh, this is pretty cool. Like, where else can we kind of find the opportunities to kind of link them?
Amazing.
Yeah.
What was school life for you like? I know that you had a variety of interests. You were involved in social work, missionary work, community outreach work. You did a lot of work in drama. How was that experience for you, and what did you take from it?
No, absolutely. So, like, I think, you know, to sort of preface that a little bit, yeah, I definitely had a slightly unconventional childhood when growing up here in Hong Kong. You know, aside from being, you know, a third culture kid, and kind of having that, you know, I will call it, you know, slightly a bit of an identity crisis, you know. You know, I was a very Caucasian looking kid, but even at a young age, I spoke Cantonese very fluently. Parents put me into local school, and there was a bit of a trial and error there in terms of finding like the right environment for me, as well as for my younger brother. But yeah, I think like, yeah, when I was basically around 12, you know, unfortunately my mum passed away when I was a young boy. And I think that sort of played a big role in terms of, even for my dad raising us as well, really to not baby us too much, but then also making sure that we're kind of growing up in like the right environments. So jumping between different schools, different social groups, that was one aspect. I think my dad being a single parent as well, also tried different parenting techniques to raise me and my brother. One of them being, you know, going to church. We weren't necessarily religious when we were growing up, but, you know, I would say that, you know, there was definitely a lot of great values, regardless of what your beliefs are. I think that kind of community aspect, you know, growing up with sort of people with a genuinely good agenda, and a genuinely good, you know, motive to kind of do things. Missionary trips, things like that, that definitely played a big role. I grew up in a lot of the schools as well, so like Catholic schools, Christian, I wouldn't say Christian schools, actually no, yeah, Catholic schools for the first main half, and then a Christian school in the second half, all of which, again, you know, I think they fundamentally played a big role in that idea of, okay, look, do a bit more than yourself. There was definitely this one phrase, one of the fathers from the local school I went to, YN College, his name was Father Naylor, and he just had this really, really great phrase, which was basically just like, leave the place better than you found it. Simply. That weren't his exact words, but the learnings from that was very simple. And I think that subconsciously as a young boy, you know, you're not going to be like 12-year-old going, oh, that's a great, you know, nugget of wisdom. I'm going to carry that with me. It's just over time, you know, it's kind of embedded in, you know, itself in my head. And as I kind of got older, I think that truth started to kind of take shape a little bit more in terms of, okay, look, how do I do something that's a bit more than me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Stepping away from school, you went into sales.
Yes.
And, you know, you're obviously a very compelling communicator, but your first job out of education was working in retail, in fashion retail with Hollister.
Yes.
What was that experience like in terms of helping you to decide what your career aims would be?
No, it's always a really good question to start off with. So I took the I suppose now the slightly more unpopular route of kind of skipping uni. I think I was sort of like raised, and I was growing up in that generation where the narrative around, well, you don't really need university anymore. That was really starting to surface a bit. And I remember as I was growing up as well, you know, the last couple of years in university, me and some friends were quite, you know, one could say like maybe like entrepreneurial in the beginning. So always interested in these different ways of, well, how can one make money early on? The ideas of like, you know, that Forbes 30 under 30, you know, millionaire by 20. There's a lot of ideas around that. So I realized that during my high school years as well, I just didn't really know what that next step was. I didn't know where my passion was. I knew the importance of having to make a buck, you know, especially in growing up in Hong Kong, like you can't afford to be broke. So there was a decision I kind of made with myself where I was like, look, I can spend 4 years trying to find a direction and hopefully, you know, get a degree in something that I actually care about, or I can spend that next 4 years trying to make some money.
Yeah.
And so decided to kind of, you know, roll the dice, went with the money-making route. A lot of different odd jobs back and forth. Back then, anything from like, you know, teaching English, F&B, bar back, all that stuff. But I think Hollister was the first gig where, again, yeah, like a real company, a real brand, a real job, so to speak. And I kind of really, you know, it was quite lucky, you know, for those that might remember Hollister, especially in Hong Kong, which was such a big thing. The social aspect was great. And I think that was kind of what stuck with me a lot in terms of like the benefit, well, the positive memories, you know, meeting people, the staff there, the kids who was working around there, which was great. But then it also made me realize very clearly as well what I didn't like doing, which I think it wasn't as clear at that moment, but down the line, I realized it was like, yeah, things like selling a product and, you know, trying to edge someone to pick something that I don't know why they want it. That just didn't really click well with me.
Sure.
But yeah.
Coming out of that, you joined Crossfire Arena.
Yes.
Where you had a huge role. You contributed a lot, and you did a lot to take Crossfire from basically a small scale archery tag provider to a really leading indoor events company in Hong Kong, working very closely along with the founders. The question I had for you there was, were there any similarities that you discovered in that game environment in Crossfire, which inspired the work that you do in the metaverse today?
Yeah, no, I mean, massively. Crossfire was definitely one of those very, very rare to find gems, especially in Hong Kong. Like, you know, been here my whole life, like 30 years, done a lot of different games, a lot of businesses to set up here. But Crossfire had a couple of unique things about it that I think really made it special over the years. Number one, the nature of the business, right? So, you know, again, for those that aren't familiar with like archery tag, you know, essentially imagine combining dodgeball with bows and arrows within one game. So we started off doing that. And then with each event that we kind of ran and hosted, we realized like, look, hey, people are coming this as groups. They're doing this as parties, you know, whether it's a kid's birthday party, whether it's like a corporate event, or something good to do as a group on the weekend. And we didn't really have a venue. So as we were kind of, you know, scaling up and looking for a venue, we kind of realized, well, you know, how can we create a place where we're creating experiences? You know, we're designing, so to speak, you know, kind of, or curating what we think would be a great archery tag experience in Hong Kong. Which then kind of grew into, well, what's going to be a great, you know, sort of day party or a party experience. So, yeah, I mean, from many stages, you know, starting with, oh, okay, well, how do we go from a small little, you know, renting the playground of a local school to kind of scaling up into like our own venue, depending on, again, size of the group, the age of the group, the preferences of the group, how are we designing and catering these different parties for them. I think that definitely played a massive, massive role now, as, you know, a lot of what we do now at Shadow Factory is designing digital experiences. Right. Designing these games, designing things for people. And I think the process of kind of starting from, well, okay, it's not about what I think is a good idea. It's not necessarily about what I want. It's more going, this is what I have. This is who the customer is, or these are who the people are. How do I pair that for them? Which sounds easy to say now, but I think it was interesting because we never really thought about it. We just did it over the last couple of years. And then at the end of it, you know, by the end of the third year, I think we were all kind of sitting there going, I think we're experienced designers, guys. Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Crossfire has become really big. So, you know, congratulations on that work. Thank you. In between Crossfire and Shadow Factory, you worked with Byrom. Now, yes. Byrom is obviously major in the sports event management industry and sports event consultancy industry, you know, working on projects such as the Russia 2018 World Cup, the 2014 World Cup in Brazil, the Ryder Cup, to name just a few. Can you speak to the skills that you might have picked up in that role? And, you know, what did you learn from that experience? So that actually ties very much into sort of one of the reasons why I made that transition from Crossfire to something like Winterhill was, you know, as beautiful as those 3 years were. And again, like most of the people I worked with at Shadow Factory was friends. You know, I was the general manager there. I hired a lot of my mates. My younger brother was working with me. And it was one of these sort of, it was almost like an acid trip of 3 years of just best time experiences with my best mates. Yeah. But I think, you know, we all kind of came to this point after a while where we were like, okay, look, what's next? You know, as great as it was, like, you know, we all showed up and we're all having fun and we get to do these parties with people. You know, I think, and it was interesting because it wasn't just me. I think there was definitely a couple of us as well that kind of felt, okay, well, this is great, but we're starting to kind of hit the ceiling of this, you know, young teens working together type of gig. Like, what's next? You know, what's the next challenge? With Winterhill, I think the big thing was, it was definitely me taking a big leap into doing something I didn't think was within my capabilities at all. A lot of the clients that we served at, you know, Byron and Winterhill, those were trying to, you know, we were like the hospitality partner. So we would sell the VIP boxes, we would sell, you know, the box passes and things like that. So one, the price point, and, you know, these were all like high ticket items, which I really didn't have any contact with before. You know, I feel like I could probably say this now, like now that we're kind of like, you know, that's a past chapter of my life. But I think that was really a big testament to like, look, how good are you at selling? Because, you know, I would say that I sold myself into that role. Right. And then at the same time as well, not just me selling myself into the interview, it was also selling myself to go, well, look, man, like you might be able to do this. You know, it doesn't matter if like, you know, I get some of these packages were like 150, you know, thousand US dollars. And, you know, I was just sitting there going like, okay, this could be cool. Then again, it was very, very money driven as well, right? As was the nature of a, you know, or as most sales job, it was very like, you know, income driven, profit driven. But I think after a while, you know, I was there for about like a year and a bit more. What I had a big takeaway from that point was, okay, I know that the money bit is what I need. And I think at least I know that I've kind of secured that in terms of my experience and my capabilities to do it. Then that word, you know, what I like to call like sort of like the F word kind of like started floating, which was like fulfillment. Which again, like, you know, you're a young 20-year-old in Hong Kong. That's not really something that, it's not really cool to think about. I think at the time it was very much just like, look, are you making bank? You know, like how much money are you making? You know, like, are you partying? You know, can you afford to do stuff? Now I was starting to get in that bit where I was like, okay, like I want to wake up on a Monday. Like I want to be excited about the next day. And I think like, as I was kind of working there at Byrom, you know, as much as I realized the transition for me, what I needed in my career, it was also realizing that like, okay, cool, like the cash is important. The cash game needs to be there. But on another hand, that's not it. That's like one half of the equation. Yeah. So I convinced myself that I can do this Byrom thing. And again, I did it fine for like a year and a half, was making pretty decent sales. And then I think that allowed me to kind of challenge myself a little bit to then go, okay, cool, what's after this?
Yeah. And which is a perfect segue because with Shadow Factory, you didn't land in there as the chief metaverse officer. You worked your way up and you started as an account manager. Can you speak to the culture that you encountered walking into Shadow Factory when you first joined?
I mean, as someone who's spent his entire life growing up in Hong Kong, I've never been to the States. All right, let me also just preface. I know I might sound a little bit American, but that's all media influence. You know, again, in the movies and TV shows, you know, you see the snippets of these like awesome gaming companies in the States or like overseas where, you know, everyone's like super young and it's super open, it's creative, and it seemed like a dream environment. The culture, I think what was a big surprise for me going to Shadow Factory was it gave me what I loved about working at Shadow Factory, at Crossfire, which was younger teams, people my age. It was a very open, it was a very, you know, there was no walls, everybody, no cubicles, right? Like open desks, everyone can see each other. You know, people were yelling ideas. There was freedom of expression. You know, there wasn't like the traditional cubicles where it had to be neat.
Right.
You know, people had their toys, they had their inspirations, their muses around the workplace. And it was just this, I mean, you know, not to sound cliche, but like the energy, man. It was like you walk into that space and it was the vibe. It was the vibe of the people that just really like air was just sparking with energy, you know. And there was just this moment I walked in. I remember I just kind of looked at the office for a bit and I just went, I just knew. I was like, look, this wasn't any other job interview I had where I was like, oh man, it'll be great if I had this. You know, it was like, oh, it'd be sick if I could kind of land this gig. There was something when I just sat in there and I was just like I'm not leaving without getting this job.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I think like, you know, like I wouldn't go so far as to say I felt fulfilled or was close to that, but it just, it tapped into, I think, my passion, like the part of the child in me that was like, you know, toys, ideas, cool shit, fun, like that was just the embodiment of it. And that really just kind of led me on the massive journey, which has led me to where I am now since starting.
So you've obviously had a great journey working your way through, and now you're the Chief Metaverse Officer at Shadow Factory. Can you tell people about what that role entails on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, really my role right now is, it's still quite business development driven. So it is working very closely with clients still. The main prerogative in my role is to spearhead the Web3 initiatives that we're doing as a company, whether it's internally for ourselves or whether that's externally for different clients. You know, over the past 5 years in the company, you know, I've worked with numerous of different brands across different industries. You know, I've worked with the likes of China Mobile, Red Bull. I've worked with agencies like Ogilvy. And again, what we did was essentially help businesses solve problems using a very specific type of tech and content, which was immersive tech and content, so VR and AR. The nature of the job where I'm at now is still very much the same, which is working with these clients and our team and understanding what are the best tools currently available that suits our team, that we could use to, again, solve particular problems that we know are existing now, or opening new discussions to allow us to kind of have insight, or at least to provide us with, you know, a second opinion onto something that we're doing now.
Right.
You know, I know it sounds a bit arbitrary, but the way I kind of look at it is like, look, I mean, tech is very much, a lot of this is tools that's available out there. And I suppose a good analogy one could kind of use, I'm like, you know, look, imagine me as sort of like the shopkeeper. You know, you come into like this hardware store of all these like toys and gimmicks and things to use. And I'm sort of the guy to go like, well, this is the latest in the line. Like, you know, but you're building a shed, you know, you don't need the PowerSolve 3000, you know, maybe just this will work.
Yeah.
And really that's just sort of the nature of my job. You know, again, every day is just scouring, you know, all the different corners of the internet. Whether it's sort of like the game technologies in terms of, you know, how are we helping us build these tools better, understanding as well, sort of from a cultural standpoint, what are experiences, tools, platforms that people are responding to. And then from there, formulating these different ideas, strategies that we can kind of use for, again, either ourselves or for our clients.
Great. So, Lewis, you preach the concept of getting away from the intimidating concept of building platforms in the metaverse and instead focusing on content. And the phrase that you use is hyper-curated content. Can you break down this concept to us?
Yeah, certainly. I'd love to. Hyper-curated content, in a nutshell, is the idea that you as a user gets to choose what type of content, when you want it, how you want it, irregardless of hardware or software limitations.
Right.
Now, this is not something, again, that, you know, we're saying is happening tomorrow. This is that point in time that we're building towards and we're working towards. The way that we kind of see true value that can be derived from the metaverse ecosystem, not quite just the platform as we see in Ready Player One, is exactly that. Allowing people to choose and have the power for them to experience content, media, information the way that they want to, not as much in terms of how brands or other people dictate how you should have it. Yeah, I mean, it's the same way that how some websites now, you have the option to toggle between a 3D website or a 2D website, which is something we did for China Mobile a couple of years back, or even to certain platforms out there like a platform called Spatial, where you can enter these 3D worlds either, you know, on your desktop, which is a bit more flat screen, a bit more gamey that people are traditional with, or at the same time you can chuck on a VR headset and you can go into these shared spaces. Yeah.
So you talk about choice, giving the consumer choice.
Yes.
Let's talk about Gen Z. So there are 2.5 billion Gen Z people around the world. They're set to become the largest generation of consumers.
Yes.
What do marketers need to know about the needs of Gen Z consumers?
Oh man, honestly, if I had all the answers for that, I mean, I'd be sitting on millions right now. I would say this, like, one of the key things that I think has been drastically overlooked from a lot of the conversations I have with our clients and even for people outside as well, is that when entering or when doing stuff in Web3, there's a lot of excitement around the technical discussions, and there seems to be like this huge overlook around the cultural discussion. Okay. In terms of what is the culture that these Gen Z audiences are trying to get themselves into or immerse themselves into. I'll give you an interesting thing. Like, you know, everyone talks about influencers and how do we influence choices. there's a huge trend that's happening right now, and I think it was actually BBH, the agency that came out with it, and they call it de-influencing, where Gen Z audiences tend to respond better and almost tend to flock towards people who have a voice that's a little bit more honest, that they're not trying to go, oh, this is all great and this is all positive and this is all fun, but guys that are coming out here and saying like, no, it's quite shit, and we can come out and openly talk about this. You know, it's okay to kind of share that side of it. And I think, again, that's one aspect of it. But I think, you know, when understanding sort of like what the Gen Z audiences want, there's many different retrospects around it, right? You know, on one hand, obviously, like, look, I mean, if you look at the data as well, like, you know, gaming, and in terms of using gaming platforms as a communication tool, as a point of contact to these audiences, you know, that's a huge thing. But I think the other thing to also pay attention around to it is it's not just around the platform, it's the culture around the platform. It's the culture around the users.
Right.
You know, people talk about, for example, Roblox. You know, they're like, oh, there's so many users there. You know, it's great. You want to go into it. I mean, yes, there's about 50 million users there, but it's 50 million users ranging from 8 years old to about 16 years old, you know? And the culture pools around each of these different demographics. Gen Z, I think, is almost a bit of a dangerous word to use because I think it sometimes pulls people too much.
Right.
And you sort of forget the sort of niche groups of audience pools that's out there, which I think fundamentally is really what, you know, if you're a marketer, you want to really tap yourself into those sort of niche pools. There's that whole phrase right now, and this is something we're trying to put a little bit more into practice, into our design thinking, which is something core. So for example, you know, if you're super into like lanterns or like lamps, for example, they'll have something which is, oh, this is so lamp core, you know? You know, or even stuff like, you know, if you love The Office, right? You could be like, dude, this is like Office core aesthetics,
yeah,
right? Which is, you know, and it's one of these little things, like you don't really notice it until it's almost like too late when it's all over the news. And that's almost the thing around like Gen Z right now, which is, if you know where to look for these kids to kind of talk about these emerging ideas, which is so cool, before it hits mainstream, that's where you can kind of tap into it and monetize it. I think with the Gen Z audience is you need to be where they're at, you know? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Moving on, I really liked a repost you made recently talking about glance value, and how appealing content masters the first second, the digital first impression for the consumer. Can you speak a little to how Shadow Factory approaches this and tries to approach the digital first impression?
I mean, I think, you know, the idea of glance value really is an evolution towards the narrative that we've all had for the last couple of years as well, which is, you know, the shortening of the human attention span. You know, and I think that, again, like I'm not really a psychologist, so I can't really comment on why that is. I think just looking at myself and trying to be a little bit self-reflective over the last couple of years, it's, you know, I think it's a result of having too many options out there. And as part of that as well, the idea of glance value is really, because I have so much options, I have so much out there, again, the battle for me to win you over right there, right then. You know, whether that's a thumbnail image, whether that's, you know, the clickbait title, all of these sort of like trends and techniques that content creators and marketers are using, it's all really kind of boiling towards this, how first glance, you know?
Right.
Love at first sight, almost type of idea. And again, like, look, there's a lot of what we're realizing as well, that traditional methods and techniques that marketers have been using, for example, things like color psychology, that still plays a huge, huge impact onto it. But ironically, touching back to kind of what we're saying about culture, I think it's also understanding sort of what are the traits and elements that one jumps towards. You know, it's good that people are now, you know, realizing things like thumbnail images are super important. You want to nail it. It's got to be, you know, like bright or reactive and reactions. And it's almost like you're trying to tell the whole story in one go. But I feel like that isn't necessarily the, you know, the end goal of it. I think really what it is invoking that emotion, you know? And like right now, they're really, you know, I can't really sit here and kind of give like, you know, the golden formula as to how you nail that. You know, what I can say is from how we're trying to go about it right now is understanding, well, look, in terms of the colors that we're using, the text that we're using, the imagery that we're using, or even the little GIF that when you hover your mouse over and it plays over, what's that emotion that I immediately invoke? Because I think that is the one thing that is common across all humans across the board, right? How I trigger that emotion is one thing, but when we feel that emotion, how it drives you to kind of find out more, either repel you or attract you, you know, that has sort of remained a bit constant over the last couple of years. And I think, like, you know, if we're talking about glance value, like, that's really where it is right now, is how are you invoking that initial emotion? And if you understand that, you know, if you can do that, that's actually enough to attract, attain, and acquire a certain lead, customer, or user, I think that maybe helps a little bit, you know, and you know, amongst this era of, oh, well, it's the title, it's got to be more clickbaity, or your thumbnail needs to be this and that. Simplify that a little bit more and just go like, okay, what's the feel?
Sure. I'd like to talk about NFTs.
Yes.
The word NFT, does it get in the way of people understanding the utility of NFTs? Obviously, NFTs have use cases which are very wide and practical, but is there perhaps a stigma around the word?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Cut it there. Yes. No. Oh, man. There is a gross overuse of those three letters. And for good reason as well. You know, it's, you know, when it first kind of kicked off, really, again, nobody says the whole name, non-fungible tokens, right? The interesting thing about that is, you know, if you're really trying to boil it down, like the thing about NFTs was the NF, the non-fungibility. At the end of the day, the T meant it was just a digital token, right? A representation of something. Now, what the, you know, the big misconception that I definitely see, especially the media, how they played it was, you know, we use the term NFT to simplify the fact that that technology was being used in a digital collectibles market. You know, I could spend hours going into this, but, you know, at the end of the day, NFT, those three words, is the underlying technology that allows a product to be non-fungible, right? And if you don't know what that means, definitely recommend you looking that up, because we're not going to sit here and spend hours going into this. But I think the problem was because it was so easy for someone to drop those three letters without having to explain the nature of blockchain, fungibility, what are the benefits of non-fungibility. It became this almost, you know, trigger word that it's like, you know, NFT, you're a tech guy. Almost the same way. And you know, I remember like when I first tried to get into financial literacy, just as I was getting out of high school, and when I first started understanding what, like, you know, interests, mortgage, you know, and then it's almost, you know, and I think that was the interesting thing. Like, you know, that was kind of what the finance world did. You know, they took these simple words with a lot of complex, you know, and you basically go like, it's okay, look, I know NFTs, I know mortgages, trust me, you know, I'll handle this. And I think that's what's happened now. What's interesting is, you know, back a couple months ago, NFTs was very much, again, only applied to digital collectibles. However, you know, there wasn't any hype around that name. So if you said digital collectibles, it wasn't sexy. It wasn't Web3. It wasn't blockchain. It wasn't cryptocurrency. And there was benefit to try and pull everything together, you know, because there was this idea that was like, oh, it's leveraging all the latest technologies. I think where we're at right now with all of the things that's happened over like sort of the last 24 months, you know, across all the different spectrums of blockchain tech, cryptocurrencies and all that, what we're seeing now is that there's a huge demand to shift away from that technical jargon and start using the traditional terms that each industry was used to. You know, for example, now people aren't just saying, oh, an NFT PFP to join a community, because what, right? To most of the people, now they're saying like, hey, join our membership. You're not even mentioning Web3 anymore, right? Because even that term kind of scares people off. And I think that's the interesting thing, which is, you know, the technical hype of trying to be cool and trendy, I think that's also fizzled out. And I think people are trying to step back into what they know and understand, which I think was the biggest thing that was missed out in this whole space, which was, you know, that idea that, oh, Web3 is here to replace everything. It absolutely isn't. You know, tech has thrived when it's there to enhance and improve, not to replace. And I think the fact that, you know, now we're starting to see the language shift away from, you know, oh, NFT this, NFT that, but people are using terms like, you know, exactly, hey, it's actually a digital membership, or even a Web3 membership, Web3 loyalty program. People are like, Asia Miles, I get that. There's a new thing called POAPs, POAPs, you know, proof of attendance protocols. Basically what that means is, you know, you have let's say you buy the Tomorrowland membership.
Yeah.
You went to the one last year. Well, guess what? They drop you a one-of-a-kind exclusive thank you collectible or a POAP to say, hey, thanks for attending, Chris. You actually made it. This is to prove that you did it. You know, any kind of perks and stuff coming down the line. They're just using more friendlier terms.
Yes.
So I think right now, yeah, being able to step back from those crypto bro terms and go back to basics, which is terms that you understand, your consumers understand. That's where we're starting to see a lot of success right now. Normalization,
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's move on to talking about the work from Metaverse concept. Shadow Factory is, of course, the first company in the world to introduce a work from Metaverse policy. They talk about, you know, the line is how, you know, offices exist because there's a need for human connection. But with this platform, that can be achieved virtually. How does human connection created through this platform compare with real life connections in practice? What have you found there?
So that's the question itself is super interesting, because I think because for the interesting for our company as well is that, you know, we've been working with everyone under the same roof for, you know, the last 7 years that the company's been around, you know. And again, for us, like, everything is sort of done within our Hong Kong office. So like all of our producers, artists, everything is under the same roof. So for us, it wasn't necessarily as much about building these new connections and building these new, building the new connections with people. It was more about how do we enhance and how do we just sort of strengthen what we already have. For us, again, like, a lot of the tools that we use are across the whole sort of AR, VR production line. So there was a huge demand even for us. COVID definitely spiked up the need for it, but even prior to COVID, you know, a place where people can come in and virtually collaborate. You know, there were tools that we already needed as designers, as builders as well, to kind of go, look, how do we express ideas more effectively? You have, you know, like, management flying abroad. We have, like, salespeople all over the place. You know, if we need to communicate a concept or an idea on the fly, you know, how do we do that better? So for us, the work from Metaverse policy was more so to, I would say, like, enhance the connections that we already had as a team. Where I also see for, like, outside parties and entities, you know, and sort of like newer businesses that are also approaching this, I would say this, like, again, the tech is not here to replace, right? You know, we were never about like, oh, this is to eliminate the need for everyone to come into the office. The office is still going to be here. And again, there are, you know, numerous benefits and plethoras of reasons why we need and still have to maintain a physical location and a physical business. Really, the idea for us was like, look, how does Metaverse technology make it easier for us? If someone does need to work from home for whatever reason, right? Like, that's cool, we get it, right? Like, but how do I enable you to still do what you need to do in a way that is still fun and engaging, which is what we strive to kind of deliver at the office.
Right.
Being able to kind of do that, I suppose, in a platform where there is freedom of expression. You know, we are, as a company, a little bit more understanding of each other's quirks and behaviors. does this platform allow us to be a bit more of ourselves, communicate our thoughts better? We definitely believe so. And I think this is what we're trying to work towards and test with being one of the first companies to really, stand behind this. I think for different brands and different companies as well, there is an element of experimentation that's going to be needed. There's definitely a growing period, but I think one of the big things is, as long as you're not looking at this new trend as a replacement, if you're not trying to look at it as like, can I close down an office? Can I, not do meetings and things like that? But more so to kind of go, well, if the physical thing is running, how can this in tandem elevate it?
I see. Make
it more effective. That is, really for us, we're trying to be a little bit more of like a role model and a leader in. Again, for us as well, is if, us as the builders, if we don't use it, if we don't have a need for it, very hard for me to find a reason or a cause to kind of talk to someone or convince someone that this is actually relevant for them as well.
Let's move on to the subject of hardware in VR. Now, some might say that the current generation of hardware is too cumbersome for most applications. You have personally also commented on the potential of smart glasses to gain traction and be a solution here. Where do you currently stand on the viability of the hardware offering that's out there, and what future do you see?
Realistically, right now, I would say if we look across the board, VR as a entertainment option for consumers is a massively growing trend right now. I think the last tally that Meta did in terms of the number of Oculus 2 headsets sold globally since they started, I think it's somewhere around 20 million headsets. And this isn't accounting for other brands like HTC, Pico, Vario, other brands, Valve, who've had their headsets out for a while. The interesting thing, what I've seen is this, VR was very much originally geared towards the hardcore users, right? People who, it's the affordability, because the cash that was needed to get the hardware set up to use these VR headsets was quite substantial. I remember when I first joined Shadow Factory, the most standard headset was the HTC Vive. Yeah. And that was basically that would set you back about 12 grand Hong Kong a pop, the headset. Not accounting for, a gaming PC that's maybe about 20 grand Hong Kong custom build. But the interesting thing for that was because the barrier to entry was so high, you attracted a lot of people that were just so receptive and they were so engaging with what little content there was in the beginning. Now that there's more of this demand, I find interesting when people are like, VR headsets are cumbersome, it's too heavy, it doesn't feel good. I mean, a lot of these are valid. I absolutely get where they're coming from. But I also feel that a lot of these comments stem from experiences on either an expo or maybe you see it at a shop. You haven't really, or those people I feel haven't really had an opportunity to be immersed in an experience that matters to them. Right? Again, for me I use VR for just intense gaming. So it made absolute sense for me to don an Oculus Quest 2. The game I've just been obsessed with is this one called Onward, which is this first-person shooter.
Big fan.
Love it, right? And when I'm on it, 40 minutes goes by. I don't stop till it literally goes, right, it's searing my head because it's so hot, right? And it's telling you, okay, right, your battery's running low. Aside from that, I think the weight fatigue, maybe I've gotten used to it, but it doesn't really matter to me as much. I've also noticed that when I host experiences for clients, when they come to our company, our office, and they want to try out some of the VR experiences, even if it's, sort of the office lady who's in her 40s, a lot of makeup, for a fact, even just showing her a VR headset, you're just she's going to be nah. But if the content was geared and say, if you were hey, actually, this was a Louis Vuitton created VR experience, actually, this is quite retail driven, and, it's very, something that relates to them, right? They cross that threshold. And like all things, like, you know, anyone that's been a gamer, or if you spend way too much time on a device, right, you'll know that discomfort it's just in the mind. I'll give you another example, right? Like, you know, how many times have you just laid in your sofa and just such an awkward angle, but the show was so good on Netflix that by the time you stood up, you're like, oh my God, it's been 2 hours since I've been twisted. And to me, it's almost that same idea. And with where headsets are going now, like, you know, I have no doubt that you're going to have a lot more different brands opening up right now. They're designing headsets that are all trying to solve and answer a different complaint from the consumer market. You know, some of them are, hey, it's weight distribution. You know, so you've got, for example, the new Pico 4. You know, the battery packs is at the back. You know, I actually tried that. One of my colleagues got it in the office. And look, don't get me wrong. Like, you know, first feeling, I was like, dude, yeah, this feels great. Again, not really an issue for me, right? And I think what's interesting now is that there's two major pools of consumers that everyone's trying to build headsets for, right? Consumers and enterprise, you know, and the enterprise clients and the ones, you know, your Boeings, your, you know, BMWs, those guys are needing VR headsets for their work purposes. You know, the needs for those headsets are different because they're not necessarily trying to cater for the guy that's wanting to spend 2 hours in the headset. They're very more about, okay, look, you know, I've got designers that are working with this tool, right? For them, it's more about visual clarity. It's about functionality. It's about interoperability, right? How do I work with their existing software? It's a lot of different needs, right? So there's a whole line of headsets that's being developed for that. And to be honest, like that's where the big money's at for a lot of these brands. Sure. You know, you're seeing that with Meta, you're seeing that with Oculus, and a lot of them are gearing towards that. The interesting thing is I feel that when the consumer market opens up a little bit more for VR headsets, you know, guys like PlayStation, I still feel like they're dabbling the waters. They're still testing the waters by doing something that's bespoke to them. There's going to be a huge jump. I don't know when, but I think like, you know, when the overall consumer market is more mature for this, there's going to be another jump in terms of like, oh, what's the next gen of VR headsets going to look like? What answers are they trying to solve? Because I would say right now, like, yeah, if you go on, go on VR chat or whatnot, there's very few people that's, you know, they're complaining about how uncomfortable the thing feels. Everyone's just more like, look, where's the next best, you know, where's the that next best game?
Absolutely. So on the subject of AR, so Shadow Factory backs AR as a key need for a Gen Z focused marketing strategy. You know, the line is that digital natives expect personalized, immersive experiences. Shadow Factory is obviously a leading provider of AR solutions, AR filters. Can you speak to the effectiveness of Shadow Factory's AR solutions for marketers and for their consumers?
No, excellent question. I would say the big thing about AR technology or augmented reality technology, especially for marketers, is that it gives an opportunity for your audience to, you know, really embody themselves as ambassadors by creating user-generated content.
Right.
You know, and this is probably, you know, again, for regardless of whether or not you're Web3 or whatnot, right? For marketing, it's such a huge thing. You know, if you're able to get your audiences to talk about your brand themselves, that's far more compelling than any marketing campaign really can do. You know, what we're seeing now with AR on the consumer side for marketers, right, is that when you have that story that you're trying to tell as a brand, again, it allows your users to embody it in different ways. You know, so filters that we saw in the beginning many years ago, right? You know, especially like, look, I mean, the most successful ones were definitely like, you know, like the dog face ones, right? Where especially, like, you know, anyone that was doing a selfie, it just kind of covered you up, gave a little bit of novelty around it. But then later on, you know, I think one of the big ones we saw was actually, I think Gatorade did a filter during the Super Bowl. And that was actually one of the big case studies that really pushed forward in terms of why AR tech was such a big thing for Gen Z, because I think it generated, I can't remember the exact numbers and statistics, but I remember the fact was that the filter itself got more views. I don't think of views. It got more shares. it got more shares of that particular moment, which was, okay, so you know in the Super Bowl at the end of the game, right, the winning team always takes a thing of Gatorade and dunks it on the coach.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Gatorade created a filter just for that. And prior to the moment of that particular Super Bowl where the team won and they dunked it on the coach, there was basically record breaking, right? I'll definitely recommend. And again, anyone watching now, if you don't believe me, definitely check it out. Gatorade AR filter Super Bowl. It just garnered insane feedback organically. Well, you could say organically because obviously it was in tandem with the Super Bowl, but that really spoke to a lot of people in terms of, okay, well, like, it's not necessarily about, you know, creating these massive installations and, you know, massive CGI things on the, you know, on the big screen and the halftime ads. You know, there was this whole thing where people kind of got a bit obsessed about, whoa, okay, so it's not necessarily a high cost, but it's massive reach and with very, very high likelihoods of virality.
Right.
So that really kickstarted a lot of companies. So you had Meta that had Facebook and Instagram doing their filters. You had Snapchat that jumped on it, which again, I mean, I don't know how many people are actually talking about it, but Snapchat right now, I would say is, yeah, they're secretly and quietly building themselves up as like the AR powerhouse for social media right now.
Right.
Yeah, some of the biggest activations that we're seeing in terms of things like AR stores, you can have that on Snapchat. Lego did a massive one with them recently. And I think, like, yeah, people, you know, that's really what it is. You know, it's, again, going back, and especially with the discussion around marketers as well, I need to make sure I'm not sidetracking into the enterprise bit. But for marketers, really, it's more about how do you envision your customers being proud of using this filter?
Proud.
You know, I think there's a lot of times where, you know, we've seen filters that has been deployed out there where it just kind of felt like, you know, there wasn't a consideration as to why or how your audience would use it. There was more of this idea, and it felt like, you know, oh, if we build it, they'll come. You know, oh, if I deploy this filter, people will just jump onto it, right? Is it, again, kind of tapping into what we were saying about the Gen Z thing earlier as well, right? Because, again, that's where most of the users are. You know, what's the culture around it? You know, if you really think that, oh, because I'm Coca-Cola and, oh, they'd love to be, oh, they're a Coca-Cola can, like, no, right? You've completely missed the mark. You know, you don't understand why they'll use this to make content. You know, are they using this to, I don't know, as mockery? You know, because again, everyone likes dry humor, right? Like anti-humor seems to be the best type of comedy now, right? So is your thing acknowledging and responding to that? Or will people use your content and your filter if you don't respect kind of what they're doing in a more derogatory fashion? You know, so they use that as almost like, I'm trying to find another way for memeable, because I feel like memeable has more of like a positive connotation, right? You know, I feel like, oh, it's a memeable filter. You know, I feel that's the sort of the new like word for viral, right? I hate the word viral because, you know, it's one of these things, like, I get the concept, right? The strive to create a viral filter is honestly should not be the ultimate goal. I think for me, like many things in tech and many things that I do in this space over the last couple of years is it fun, right? It needs to be fun, whether it's, you know, for a person experiencing it for the first time, or again, as we said, for someone who can use this asset, this content to enhance and elevate what them as a customer, as an audience feels. You know, it needs to tap on that fun aspect. And I feel like, you know, a lot of times when you're going around Gen Z activations, understandable, you know, everyone's a little bit more, as a business, you have to be very concerned about timelines and budgets and, you know, sort of the whole kind of corporate bureaucracy in terms of how you get ideas through. But the reality is this, like, you want to tap into Gen Z, you want them to, you know, with AR technology as well, especially, to embody it and be your ambassadors with UGC, you need to tap on that fun bit. And I think for us over the last the last 7 years of like building these experiences, 4 years of being an official partner for Meta, and 1 year as being an official SnapLens developer. Little shameless flex over here. And, you know, I think that's definitely what we've realized. Like, you know, the best performing ones and filters that we've ever developed were the ones that we just because it was just fun.
And that's a very important balance to strike, because you do say that people, you know, they have to be careful with their budgets. People have bureaucracy, corporate considerations.
Yes.
I know that you've given entire talks around ROI with Web3.
Yeah.
But if you can condense some advice that people can take away in short form about how they should think about ROI when investing into Web3, what might you say to that?
Be flexible with the expectations of ROI in the first couple of months, but have very, very crystal clear KPIs as you're testing out these new initiatives. I think one of the things that we've also noticed as well is, you know, when you're stepping into this realm, the idea of return on investment is different for different stakeholders and departments, right? For example, if we're speaking to like an innovation team that wants to build, you know, like a VR experience, you know, their ROI is looking at, well, look, you know, it's efficiency. Are we saving on time? Is productivity increasing? So on and so forth. Marketers, again, you're looking at the more, I would say, like traditional, like sort of metrics, you know, so we're looking at things like engagement, shareability, things like that. When moving a little bit into the Web3 metaverse ecosystem, I think one of the interesting things is that, there's a whole new pool of data and metrics that can be generated from these experiences that has not previously been considered. So I'll give you a quick example. A metaverse experience. You know, normally if I run something like that, let's say it's web-based, right? The immediate ways that people look at it is, well, how many visitations have I had? You know, how many clicks, signups, this and that, which is, it's valuable. But when you're doing things, for example, like in a game environment or a 3D virtual environment, there's something called heat mapping, which is a whole new set of data. Heat mapping, okay, I'll put it this way. If we're talking about a desktop, right? So, you know, people moving in a virtual space, the idea of heat mapping is for me to have a very, very clear idea on different timescales. Where are people congregating? Where are people interacting? What are people clicking at, hovering their mouse at, right? We're able to kind of derive all this data from clients pre-choice, right? Before they even click onto a product to show interest, right? Because again, if I'm a person, I might actually look at this 3D model hovering before I click to find out more information, right? All that data before that, is that not valuable for marketers and people to make a better decision? Absolutely. And understanding sort of where those data are. So what I find interesting is that, when dabbling into new technologies, and that's what I'm saying, like, be flexible with the ROI, because you need to be clear about why you are doing this. You know, what is the objective? What are you ultimately or fundamentally trying to improve here? But at the same time, understand that there is still a lot of new information. There's a lot of new learnings, you know? So in the first couple of months, we always say, look, just be flexible with the ROI a little bit. You know, like, let's not expect that off the bat it's going to be massive, you know, NFT 10x on the first week, you know, everyone's loaded and we're all super happy, kumbaya, but a little bit more cool. Okay, well, I didn't know this about my customers. I didn't know this about my product and my layout of my stores. Right. Does this give me better information to design my virtual store a bit better? Is my virtual store a mimic of my real store? You know, does that give me data and then understanding on? So there's a lot of different ways this can kind of branch out in terms of the ROI aspect. Sure. Yeah, and I think on the other hand as well, it's, you know, as much as it's data, there's another huge bit, which, again, I suppose it's a little bit uncomfortable sometimes to talk about when I'm in a meeting room with like some of the older clients and executives. But, you know, there's this whole other narrative, which is this, what you're building and what everyone's building now, it's the foundation for the generations that are to come. You know, to also acknowledge that this is a huge transformational point in how people engage and live digitally. Instead of just seeing it as a trend, a fad, the media is kind of playing it as, but you understand that this is a crucial shift. in terms of not us, not the current generations, right, of shoppers and spenders and who we believe are the decision makers, but to also take to heart that you have a whole generation of Gen Z content creators that are making probably what their parents made on a monthly salary, right? From just making videos, playing games, right? I'm not saying that's everyone across the board, but that is a growing demographic, right? Younger kids with purchasing power and spending power. How are you positioning your brand for them? How are you adjusting yourselves and putting these on-ramps, if you would, right? To kind of help these younger help these younger people sort of familiarize themselves with your brand. One great company that's doing this, and it's insane because, you know, you would never expect them to be the name that associates themselves very well with a much younger demographic, but Gucci is just smashing it along the way.
Oh, yeah?
Roblox, they're in it, you know, and again, there's a huge, whether or not it's their main objective, I can't comment on this, right? But what I can very confidently say is that Gucci is embedding themselves as almost one of these, you know, key brands that all these younger kids and younger gamers are growing up to in Roblox, in these different platforms. You've got platforms like Zepeto, which is, you know, South Korea's biggest sort of avatar 3D social media app. You know, Gucci made a killing there. They've partnered with, like, you know, gaming teams like 100 Thieves, which is like a massive like esports company out there, did a lot of collaboration. Gucci's even working with like the World Health Organization to put together an initiative that basically helps train esports talent while at the same time addressing all the sort of mental challenges that they're facing. So fatigue, not having friends, you know, sort of like, oh, who am I? You know, am I me? Am I my digital character? Like, they're getting so in there, all for the purpose, the way I see it as well. It's not about the money that they're going to make right now, but the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. You know, and I think there's also that element where as you're stepping into this space for brands, marketers, and whoever, is not that it's a necessity, but an opportunity for you to really grow your brand for that long game.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It's great insight.
Thank you.
Shadow Factory bases a lot of its staff and operations in Hong Kong.
Yes.
You know, we're both, you know, proud Hong Kong residents. You've mentioned that Hong Kong has the potential to become the go-to hub for Web3. Mm-hmm. At the same time, you've given, you know, talks which compare other potential Web3 hubs like Japan, like Korea, like mainland China in itself. Mm-hmm. Why Hong Kong?
I think the biggest reason, personally speaking for me as well, is the fact that we are still, to this day right now, sort of the lock and key between the West and China to the West. On one hand, we are extremely familiar and comfortable and regulated in terms of like the kind of global playing field for different types of investment opportunities. And at the same time, you know, obviously being part of China, you know, like we understand sort of what their rules and regulations are. We're right next to them. So we, you know, again, we're very familiar with what are the habits there, you know, what's the culture, so to speak, right, behind that great firewall. I think in many cases what we're seeing now is like this. As much as there, you know, people are opening up and there's more regulations around crypto trading, which I think is one aspect that's very attractive to a lot of like, you know, financial institutions and other types of clients. For me, I try to look at it as more what's relevant to me, which is the user side. And I think where we're sitting is an interesting place in Hong Kong is that because of the nature of how China's been building their blockchain network, which is very simple, everything blockchain related is completely fine as long as there's no crypto trading, right? So as long as I'm not sending tokens and I'm not sending cash, so to speak, sending digital assets back and forth is absolutely no problem, right? I think there's a very interesting name that I think China has, and I think it's literally called the non-crypto Ethereum network, and there's another one called the non-crypto Bitcoin network. I need to double check, but definitely the Ethereum one was no crypto, the non-crypto Ethereum network, right? And I think what's interesting is you look at it in Hong Kong, you know, especially over the last couple of months with everything that we've seen in crypto trading and NFT trading, and then now over the last 2 weeks with the Web3 events popping back up, is that from a business use case, from a marketing use case, and even from just the average Joe consumer use case, right? There's definitely an emerging... There's emerging trends around how this tech actually applies to you. Like we said earlier, right? Strip away that NFT jargon and call it, you know, call a spade, right? You know, hey, this is actually, you know, an honorary token for attending an event. You know, this is a membership pass. You know, this is whatever you want to call it, right? It's the product. People are starting to see it come to fruition. Now, if you're able to pair that with kind of how China's been building out their whole network, so you've got all these different brands and companies in China behind the firewall that is established, you know, their digital presence. They've got their infrastructure. They've got the strategy. They've got their assets. You know, they've figured out along that immersion scale, you know, hey, welcome to Tmall. You know, like you want to shop on Taobao? Awesome. Do you want to look at photos and images like what you're used to, what you're comfortable with? Oh, yeah, you're still there. Or do you want the new, you know, 3D avatar, go in a virtual world? It's all there in an app.
Yeah.
Right. Now, we're not commenting on, you know, the political side of everything, right? But what I'm seeing is interesting is that China has that. And the question now, what we're seeing is like, look, how do you let each other play with each other? And I think Hong Kong sits in that very, very interesting place, culturally speaking as well, to understand the nuance for, well, actually, if, for example, you're an international brand, you want to step into the China ecosystem, you want to play with these guys, sure, absolutely. This is what you got to look out for. This is what they do. You know, we can sort of serve as that beacon, if you would. And then vice versa. You've got these China brands that has been established over the last 5-10 years. You know, Feiyu, for example, right? One of the biggest sort of like shoe brands in China. You know, they're an actual brand now. You know, they're not just like a manufacturer. So how do these guys, if they want to tap into the rest of the world? Cool. You've got this infrastructure. You've got all that. Fantastic. Culturally speaking, how do you tap into the West? You know, what are people looking for? How do you play ball within these different, you know, playgrounds, regulation, like regulatory pools and this and that? Hong Kong has that very, again, as we always have been, right? The, just the transformer, the converter, you know, the secret little Diagon alley that kind of takes you to the magical world of things work. Yeah. Fantastic.
My final question is, you talk about having a calling, a purpose, which is bigger than yourself. You talk about investing in what's going to come for further generations. You are obviously a trailblazer, a pioneer, and you are a role model to many. There will be many watching and looking up to you who want to do what you do and be like you one day. If you could encapsulate just some advice or some values that you would pass on to close with to those who might want to follow in your footsteps, what perhaps might that be?
There's like no way to kind of go about this without sounding cliche at all, is there? Look, I think, you know, really just pulling from my personal experience, you know, for me, it was when I was younger, like my mom passed away from suicide. And it was very difficult for me to figure out how to communicate with people, especially at a young age with like therapists and all that. And even with like family members as well, just to talk about kind of what happened. For me, it was slightly off tangent here, but for me, it was like through gaming, through the form of play, that I was able to sort of internalize and understand what has happened. You know, the fact that in video games you could kind of kill death and you can kill all these like crazy concepts, that was a huge healing factor for me. And I think from that point on, it really solidified the importance, I wouldn't even say importance, but the relevancy of games and kind of God, I'm almost going to sound a bit crazy here. Like, you know, detaching myself from reality, you know, sort of the disillusionment of that, oh, this doesn't have to suck. This can actually be fun. This could be enjoyable somehow, despite the nature of this being a difficult time.
Yeah.
That is kind of, I feel like in many ways translated for me, like whether it's been my work, whether it's been my studies and all that, it's that fascination of, look, why can I spend 6 hours in World of Warcraft, like literally performing repetitive tasks over and over and over and over and over again, sometimes by myself, right? When I know there's real world things happening, how can I immerse myself in that and derive fun from that? For me, what I've been trying to do, I think, throughout my whole career is that no matter all the different jobs I've been trying to pick and, you know, all the different callings and this and that, whether it's making money, fundamentally, I think where I've thrived and what I've always done best is when I'm able to have that element of play in my work, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's like, oh, fine, like, you know, the chillest startup and then, you know, just, do nothing on beanie couches and like, wouldn't it be dope if we could do this? But find that way where you can kind of treat it as play. Like, you know, we talked about this a little bit earlier, like Alan Watts, right? Big influence on me, and a lot of the stuff that he kind of talks about, you know, his whole principle with life is play. You know, the way that when a child kind of looks at the world, or you know, it's excitement, it's fun. Yeah. When you're able to, and again, you know, I can't really tell you how I did it. I think it was just like, you know, over the course of 30 years, I just slowly kind of put one thing together, and I had my own way of kind of coping with life. But I think like look, for anyone who might be in a similar situation as I was, when you didn't really know what to do and you're kind of overwhelmed by the number of possibilities that's out there, look, just play. You know, we're all going to have one shot at this regardless, right? So if you're able to do it in such a way that it's just enjoyable to you, and again, that's also the trick, right? How do you play? What makes you happy? You know, because that's a part that you can't overlook as you go on your journey, finding what your calling is. You know, experimenting with different things, and then, you know, realizing just, hey, I like this. And this is actually pretty cool. Like, you know, I want to do this a little bit more. You know, and then understanding that, again, like, that, you know, it is the long run, right? You know, it's not just about what your job is right now today. You know, you're going to be doing this for the next, I don't know, year, 5 years. For me, I mean, to me, it's already been 5, you know, and I never really saw myself as the type of dude that would spend more than, you know, 2 years in the same workplace. And now it's been 5, and I can't wait for the next 5. So I would say, yeah, treat it as play.
Fascinating insight. A wonderful, informative interview. I learned a lot. I'm sure that all the viewers learned a lot, not just about Web3, but about life as well. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you, Lewis Lupton.
Cheers, man. Absolute pleasure, Chris.